Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kilton with Alpha Wireless. You're here for the webinar regarding CBRS. Let's address your concerns. We'll wait a couple minutes before we get started, so just sit tight and hang on. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kilton, Director of Sales for U.S. Fixed Wireless with Alpha Wireless. I'd like to thank you for all joining today as we address your concerns with CBRS. What you will see is a poll that has likely popped up on your screen. We're just looking to collect a little bit of information on what you have done with CBRS or 365, and if you're familiar with Alpha Wireless. So if you could take a few moments and just click on those to help us collect a little bit of information, I promise we won't spam you. With that said, I would like to welcome our panelists this afternoon. We have Richard Bernhardt, a National Spectrum Advisor of WISPA, Rob Katcher, Business Development of Google, Matt Guzzo, Network Operations Manager of Hudson Valley Wireless and Communications, Elizabeth Bowles, President and CEO of Aristotle Unified Communications, Rick Harnish, Chief Marketing Officer of Baicells Technologies, and Matt Mangriotis, Product Manager of Cambium Networks. We have a fantastic group of people here today that are hopefully going to address a lot of your questions. I do please take advantage of the Q&A section within the webinar, and we'll try to answer your questions towards the end of this particular webinar. I will move through and we will address specific questions that have kind of come up over the last few weeks, if not the last few months, on a lot of the generic concerns that folks have been having with CBRS. But first, I want to talk a little bit about Alpha Wireless. This is kind of our innovative antenna solutions. What we do as a company, we're focused on canister antennas, which a lot of us are familiar with omnis, but we don't just do omnis inside of those typical configurations. We do things such as back-to-backs, concealment. We also do your typical panel antennas and small cells. Founded in 2007 in Ballyburdis, Ireland. We have over 400 customers in 22 countries globally. We do a lot of work with the major tier ones and mid-tier mobile network operators. We do a lot with neutral host, OEM manufacturing for other major companies. And obviously we do a lot of work within the WISP market, which is primarily my focus. And should be noted, we are manufacturing in Ireland. Kind of to review our product portfolio, this is a quick visual glance of what we do. You see some of the canister configurations. And this one particular one on the left, it kind of represents a significant high capacity canister. We also have our concealment, which we talk a lot about. Many of you have seen at some shows that we've effectively been calling the WISP can as we continue to develop that for that market. But it is currently deployed by a very large mobile network operator across this country and others. And of course, we have our typical panels, and we have 4x4, 8x8, and much bigger capacity beamforming solutions. And of course, small cell solutions as well, that if you've happened to be to any of the last couple Super Bowls, you've likely seen our antennas out around the perimeter. One of the things we pride ourselves at Alpha Wireless is concept to completion in 90 days. So as you can see here, this is a cute little graphic, but it isn't one of our antenna systems. We can come up with an idea and we can have it production ready in that 90 days. And we just look forward to working with you on any unique situations that you may have to present to Alpha Wireless as you work through to grow your networks. Alpha Wireless has really cut its teeth on the 3.5 band. In the US, it's obviously known as CBRS and NN licenses before that, but worldwide, 3300 to 3800 has been heavily deployed, and Alpha's been in that market for many, many years. As you can see, it's been very popular in LTE networks and, quote unquote, 5G for tomorrow, and it's all ready to go for that configuration. We support fixed, mechanical, and remote electric tilt options, and we have very large multi-point and gain portfolios. Most of you that are probably on this call already understand that what is CBRS, but we're going to just do a quick brief overview to move in to set the foundation for what this webinar is all about and addressing your concerns. The Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS, is 150 megahertz of the mid-band spectrum that's been made available from 3550 to 3700 megahertz in the US. It is unlike other spectrum where it is now a shared spectrum that any entity can request to use. CBRS is coordinated by a Spectrum Access System, or a SAS. We have one of our SAS partners joined us today in Google. This ensures that everyone gets fair access to spectrum. The SAS must have access to the environmental sensing capability, which is also known as the ESC network, to manage the dynamic spectrum use. In order to request spectrum within CBRS, you must complete your Certified Professional Installer, or CPI, as many folks have been hearing as of late. This training, which is becomes registered with a WIN form, and this certificate upon completion will need to be registered with your SAS vendor of choosing. What is the Spectrum Access System, or the SAS? The SAS, as you can see, I'm not going to read this verbatim, but it's an automated frequency coordinator that allows us all to work together. And kind of the rules of how this works out, I'll lay out quickly, is Tier 1 is for the incumbent users such as fixed satellite operators and the federal government. Tier 2 are PALs, or Priority Access License. You guys are probably hearing a lot about this auction that's going to be coming up regarding it. PAL users are those who acquire spectrum through the auction. The SAS will ensure that the PAL users don't cause harmful interference to Tier 1 and will protect PAL users from those operating the General Authorized Access, or GAA. GAA will deploy a lightly licensed type of architecture, not entirely different than what we're familiar with in NN being lightly licensed, but the SAS will ensure that the GAA doesn't cause harmful interference with Tier 1 and 2, or quite frankly, each other. It should be noted that the spectrum is not being used by one tier, it can be accessed by another via the SAS. This enforces the use of a truly shared spectrum. Current approved SAS vendors: Google, CommScope, Federated Wireless, and Sony. The question that's often been coming up is, what is a Certified Professional Installer, or a CPI, and why do you need it? As part of FCC 96 rules state that the applicable CBRS devices, or CBSDs, be professionally installed. A CPI may physically install CBSD him or herself and may take the responsibility for the data accuracy entered into the CBSD by another installer. All Category B CBSDs require a CPI. Essentially, all devices in a fixed wireless network are Category B CBSDs and will require a CPI. A Category A CBSD is installed 6 meters height above average terrain and unable to self-geolocate, also requires a CPI. And here's some power requirements as stated as well, what makes the difference between Category A and a Category B. It should be noted, previous NN license under Part 90 rules, which a lot of us are familiar with, were 40 dBm ERP per 10 megahertz. CBRS allows fixed wireless operators to reach further than before because of the new improved power limits. And here is where you can obtain some of your CPI training. We have Google, CommScope, Federated Wireless, C3 Spectra, and Nokia. What does CBRS cost? Well, this is going to vary from your vendor to vendor and your SaaS providers. The lowest publicly announced rate that we've been made aware of to date, at least in my experience, has been $225 per link per month and $0 per month for the access point or eNode B. Now, what does per link mean? Essentially, the way it digests is essentially per household. Look at it from that perspective. In some cases, you have OEM radio manufacturers have already negotiated a rate that you will pay, and in others, you will negotiate a rate directly with a SaaS vendor. Now moving on from that kind of introduction and base foundation of CBRS, which I have quite frankly simplified, I am going to ask Rob Katcher and Richard Bernhardt to address some of the questions that have come up recently. And of course, if there's more questions as we move through this webinar, please, we will address those towards the end during the Q&A section. So moving on, there are several companies that will be or operating CBRS around me. Will I be granted spectrum for use? Rob, I'll let you take this one.
Well, while Rob is adjusting his microphone, maybe I'll take that one first. Would that be okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Richard. I finally found my mute button.
Okay. So as many of you may have heard, I hope you've heard it by now, CBRS went commercially live about a week ago. And that's very big news because it opens the spectrum to anybody in the United States who wants to operate in CBRS. And CBRS at this point does not have priority access licensees. Those PAL licenses will be issued in a auction coming up in June 25th of this year. So for companies that are interested in using GAA spectrum, they can enter via one of the registered SASs, and they can operate right now. GAA spectrum is spectrum that's allowed that doesn't interfere with an incumbent. So if you are in the United States and you have you want to operate as a GAA operator, there's up to 150 megahertz of available spectrum. And why I say up to 150 megahertz is that there are incumbents, including the federal radar systems, spin 43 radars and other radar systems that are protected, and if they are in play, that those particular areas where they're in play, you can't operate within that spectrum, and the SAS will direct you otherwise. There are FSS satellite systems, or fixed-base satellites, Earth-based satellite systems that are also incumbents that have to be protected. And finally, grandfathered wireless need to be protected. Those are the NN Part 90 licenses that Cameron referred to before. But if you're not in the way of one of those things, you and anyone else are allowed to use a request spectrum on in CBRS. So the question is if several companies are asking to operate in CBRS, either in the same place or around you, will you be granted spectrum for use? The answer is, unless there are incumbents blocking you, yes, they will. And just as in 365, or for that matter in 5 gigahertz, the more that are in play, the more operators there are, the more likely that there'll be some collisions or interference. So the noise floor might get higher if you had a lot of operators operating within the same spectrum and not on a different channel. So you will be granted the use. The SAS will do its best to try and isolate you, but it is not their job in GAA to do coexistence. So you may have some interference. But the answer to the question is yes, you will be granted spectrum, and all companies have access.
Thanks. So follow-up question to that, in some scenarios, kind of, I would say extreme, is how much spectrum are you seeing or have you heard of people requesting and being granted to date?
So as with other bands, you should be cautious not to ask for more than you actually need. So just because there might be 150 megahertz of spectrum doesn't mean that you should necessarily ask for 150 megahertz of spectrum. The idea of CBRS is that it is shared spectrum, shared with incumbents, but it's also shared with other operators in your band, so other GAA operators, eventually PAL operators. And so it is possible, let's say you're in a remote rural area where there are no other operators, you're the first one to come in and there's really nobody there and there's no incumbents. If you really want to ask for 150, you can ask for 150. I'm not aware of anyone who's done that or is seeking that much spectrum right now. Most LTE systems operate on 20 megahertz of spectrum, and so they're going to either ask for 20 or 40 megahertz of channel. As we go towards 5G, there may be larger channels that people are seeking, and that might be 40 or even 60 or 80 megahertz channels. For the average WISP, a 20 to 40 megahertz channel is expected. And it's not going to be unusual to ask for those amounts. The minimum amount of spectrum that the SAS generally must allocate is 10 megahertz of spectrum.
Yeah, and just hey, this is Rob from Google. Anecdotally, we're seeing requests grants in the 20 to 40 megahertz range. That's typically what we see.
And Cameron, I know your next question is a follow-on to that, which is whether or not there will be contiguous spectrum. And the answer is generally yes, because you're asking for a single grant. And when you're asking for a grant, you're asking for a certain amount of spectrum. And assuming that the SAS can provide it, they're going to try and give you continuous spectrum. You know, if there's an interference, if there's a problem, then the SAS may come back and say that's not available. And in the case of a WISP or a fixed operator, you're operating generally your CPE, your client device, on the same spectrum as your access point or your eNode B. And so you will want to inform your SAS that you are part of a single frequency group and that you are seeking that your certain number of your CPE have to be on the same grant or on the same amount of spectrum and on the same frequency as your AP.
Yeah, and this is Rob again. Hey, just a note on the contiguous spectrum, because this is one that comes up a lot. And I can only speak to the way Google operates our SAS. We don't force any particular channels. So you can make a grant request. You can call Spectrum Inquiry. You can, we'll tell you what channels are available, what max power levels, et cetera. And then you can decide to ask for a grant on contiguous channels. So absolutely, that's something you can request. And as long as it's not interfering, as Richard mentioned, with higher priority tiers, then it's yours.
Perfect, thank you. This is another question that I've seen come up a few times in the last couple of weeks is, if I buy a PAL or several PALs, do I still need to pay to use the SAS?
So the answer is yes. I'm glad Rob piped that in, because whether you're a PAL or a GAA, you're an operator who's operating in the ecosystem of CBRS, and you are required to use the SAS, and therefore you would pay SAS fees associated with that. Now remember, no PALs yet. PALs don't exist yet.
Yeah, no PALs yet. All right, so now we'll move into kind of some practical experience. The SAS has issued me a grant for 20 megahertz. How long is that grant good for, and are there exceptions?
So I'm going to back up a little, and then I'm going to let Rob talk about the grant process. I'm going to back up to the registration process, okay, because I think it's important that people understand the processes of how you get on the band. So first off, you have a category B or category A CBSD that you want to enter into the SAS. You want to enter the ecosystem. You want to start using a radio that operates as one of those devices. And so if you are a category B device, or if you're going to operate outdoors, you're going to require a CPI to do that. If you are a category A device, which is a lower power device, a device from 30 megahertz per 10 meg, excuse me, from 30 to 47 is category B, and from 23 to 30 is category A. And if you are going to operate either of those in the system, unless you fit very, very limited requirements that almost no category A devices do, you're going to require a CPI. So you can enter your information You can have the manufacturer can pre-enter some information. Information can be done through a domain proxy, or it can be directly entered by the CBSD through a CPI in through the SAS or via a SAS API. It really doesn't matter how it's done. I get asked all the time, you know, when does the SAS know that it's being asked for that device to be registered? And the answer to that question is very simply when the CPI signs off on the registration. So when the CPI signs off on the registration and all of the necessary or required data for registration is there, the SAS then replies with a reply to say that it's there and it's been signed off and you're registered. If it's missing data, if there's errors in the data, if it doesn't have a signature, the SAS will necessarily not grant the registration because it's looking for additional information or information consistent with the system. But now you're registered, that device is installed, but you are not allowed to broadcast because you haven't yet sought a grant. And so you need to, at that point, you need to seek out a grant from the SAS. And the registration itself, as long as you are heart beating, as long as you are providing information to the SAS, has no limit. It stays on all the time. The grant is not so true. And Rob, why don't you go through what it takes to get a grant and how long it lasts?
Yeah, very good. So in terms of grant expiration, that one's actually pretty simple. As long as you're heart beating in, if we don't hear a heartbeat, the SAS doesn't hear an heartbeat from the CBSD after 7 days, then we'll terminate the grant. Now, the only other time that we would terminate a grant is if we need to protect a higher tiered user. And in those situations, so Google offers interoperability testing with device vendors. We've got some device vendors on the phone, and these are the device manufacturers like Baicells and Cambium, and to ensure that they handle those situations where a grant is terminated, then what's the recovery? How do they recover from that? But those are the only two times that we will terminate a grant.
I wanted to note, Cameron, somebody asked a question about the existing licenses that they have for 3.65, the NN Part 90 Subpart Z licenses, and he asks whether or not the 365 license is required for this. The answer is no. The 365 license, if you've registered your devices with the ULS during the time period that was required in 2015, you have an exceptional status in CBRS in that you are protected against CBRS as an incumbent. So if you do operate in 365 while your license is present and you're registered with the ULS, you're treated as an incumbent. And so that makes you a protected Part 90 user. It doesn't make you a CBRS user. If you're going to transit from 3.65 into Part 90, which is the CBRS spectrum, either because your license is expiring, which many of them will do in April of this year, then that license expires. You no longer have that license and you enter the CBRS ecosphere as a new entrant, and you just operate as if you were a 365, excuse me, as if you are a new CBRS user. There is a weird circumstance where if you have a 365 license and you're properly registered, then you try and become a CBRS operator operating in GAA, the SAS has an obligation to protect you against you, because you are both an incumbent and an operator. So you have to either choose to use your license or you have to give up your license and operate in CBRS, but doing both in the same geography at the same time can create some issues. Back to you, Cameron.
Thank you for that clarification. That's good. We had a couple questions that came along, which I think are appropriate to ask, and one I'll answer rather quickly. It says, if the EIRP for a Cat B system is 47 dBm per 10 megahertz, well, what is it at 20 megahertz? Well, it's 50. It goes up to 50 dBm or 100 watts. And for those who aren't familiar, in that same 20 megahertz, that's a 43 dBm limit under the NN Part 90 Section C ruled as it sits now. So we do get a lot more transmit power into the same spectrum. Moving on real quick, all 150 megahertz of the spectrum are consumed in my area, but I want to add another CBSD category B. Will I get a grant? What is a real world example?
Yeah,
So
so
the
I think
answer,
there's two ways to answer that question. Oh, no, Richard, go ahead, please.
no, either way, the answer is that entering into the spectrum, into the CBRS spectrum while things are GAA, before PAL happens, and assuming that there are not incumbent issues, all of that spectrum is available and everyone is entitled to it. There's no FIFO, you're not the first one in or the first one out. However, the noise floor is going to go up just like it does in 5 gigahertz or any of the unlicensed spectrum. If you request spectrum, you want to add another device, probably behooves you to coordinate some either with the SAS or with other operators around you, just as you would do today, because you're going to overlap each other. If you use channel A, I'll use channel B. You use a directional antenna this way, I'll use my directional antenna that way. Maybe you'll set up your timing separately. Those are reuse methodologies that you can use the same spectrum without having interference. The answer is, as many people as want to come in can come in under GAA as long as there isn't an incumbent issue or a higher tier issue. Was that,
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And if there was a higher tier issue, a real world example of that might be you're on the coast, you're using a spectrum administrator who doesn't have an ESC network, and there happens to also be an FSS in that area. So no ESC, no bottom 100. FSS would block the top 50, and then all the spectrum is maybe not quote unquote consumed, but it would be unavailable.
And Rob, for those on the call, what's an FSS?
Fixed
FSS
satellite
system.
Thank you.
System. Thank you. We tag team that one.
I think that effectively answers a question that came up, and it is basically this question reads: if all GAA channels are in use and the SAS gets another request, how does the SAS decide when the new request can get used, and for how long the grant expires where there's demand? So I think that effectively addresses that question, that you will get a grant, but as Richard mentioned, the noise floor is going to go up. So it does behoove all of us as operators to make sure that we're coordinating not only with the SAS, but your neighboring operators.
I think people should understand that SASs have a couple of different, if you will, powers. One of them is in the grant of the frequency, the range of frequency that they're granting, and the other is in the power control of the device. In the sphere of things, the frequency grant is the thing it's going to use the most. Only when it absolutely needs to, probably for the protection of an incumbent, would it exert its power over the power of the device. And the reason for that is because it will reduce coverage. If you reduce the power, you don't know what you're going to do to that link or that network, because the outcome is they may not be covered enough to continue to operate. So it's always best, if they're going to operate, they're going to do so by choosing the frequencies that work the best. But they do have both powers, both rights.
Fantastic. So before I get to the last two questions, which are more about PALs and the auction, there's a few questions that have come up that I think would be appropriate to address now. And one of those comes from an operator who says, I've been denied a grant for interference with another operator in the area, in the Google and federated SAS. So does this mean they are coordinating inside the GAA users?
So the question is, when you say interfering, you've been denied a grant for interference. Each of the SASs addresses what we call coexistence in a slightly different way. When it comes to interference with a higher tier or an incumbent, the incumbent and the higher tier must be protected. And that, in that case, you might be denied a spectrum request if that can't happen without your being denied that. In the case of GAA versus GAA, so it's two co-equivalent operators operating within the band, typically you won't be denied the use of the spectrum. You will just have to put up with the noise or the interference that comes along with it. But as I said, each SAS has the right to manage and control, if they want to manage and control, some degree of coexistence within the band. And it is a very controversial issue in Wind Forum and the standards body for CBRS. It's a very controversial issue in general in radio, is that how do you force coexistence? The legal standard for CBRS is found in Part 96, which is 47 CFR Part 96 of the FCC codes and rules. And if you read those, there's a section in 96 that says that operators in GAA must cooperate. That's really the extent of the legislative authority inside Part 96 on coexistence. And that doesn't give a lot of guidance to radio operators and stakeholders as to what they're supposed to do to avoid interference. So some SASs have agreed to try and coordinate the use of interfering types of technology or interfering devices to try and work with the operators to come up with methodologies to reduce the amount of interference, and that may be what they're doing. Others have said this is a bit like it's licensed by rule. It's not licensed in the traditional sense, and it's more like unlicensed than licensed, so you take your chances. And when you're in GAA, you may have a noise floor and go coordinate. But generally, you won't be denied access to the spectrum because there's interference. You will be guided on how to deal with it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
How will NN
just to echo that real. Yeah, hey, just to echo that real quick. The Google SAS would not deny a grant if there was a Part 90 operating in that area and there was interference. We could absolutely deny the grant. But if it's just GAA operating with another GAA, the grant won't be denied, and there could be instances of real-world interference. And in those cases, the operators, to Richard's point, would need to coordinate. Look, two GAA operators set up radios right next to each other. You need to coordinate that.
True also in 5 gigahertz or 2.4 or 900 and every other unlicensed spectrum.
And that's so true.
Yep.
How will NN incumbents be sensed as far as which spectrum they will have in use? Most FCC NN grants list the entire 50 megahertz for all sectors, even though they are clearly not using all 50.
That's a very good question, and it's a problematic question for a short period of time, in that some NN licensees under Part 90, subpart Z, have 25 megahertz of grant, and some have 50. Supposedly, you are supposed to register each one of your devices as you put them up, both CPE and AP. You're supposed to register them in the ULS, the FCC's ULS. Unless the NN licensed user chooses to speak with the SAS, there is no direct communication between the NN operator and the SAS. The SAS just simply knows, based upon registrations and reports, where to protect. But the exact amount of spectrum is not, correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but I don't believe you have any particular knowledge of whether they're using 25, 20, or 40 or 50 megahertz of spectrum on the NN license part.
That's my understanding as well. If an NN license is 450 megahertz, we'd protect the full 50. I can absolutely double check with our team afterwards, after this call, but that's my understanding.
And understand a very large number of you. And if you have an NN license today, I behooves you to go look at not just your license grant, but Part 90. Look at Part 90 of the code, because the Part 90 was modified some time back, and it sunsets a very large number of the NN licenses in mid part of this year, in April of this year. And on that date, those licenses will expire even if the license itself says it can go on longer. So it behooves you to check your license and check Part 90 to make sure that you have the ability to continue. If you want to continue and you are sunsetting, you may need to file a waiver request with the FCC.
Richard, thank you for that extra bit of tidbit. That is important for those who need to go a little bit beyond April to make sure you file your waiver request. Rob, is there a guard band or are all licenses stacked right next to each other?
How so? What do you mean there, Cameron?
Let's say operator A is assigned 20 megahertz at 3560, for example. Is the next operator going to be assigned at 3580, essentially right next to them for another 20 megahertz? Or is there a space in between?
Yeah, so it's a good question. If we kind of go back to kind of the fundamentals of how the SAS operates, you can make a spectrum inquiry call and see what are the max CRPs at the different channels, what's available, and then you make the grant request for where you want it. Right? So we're not necessarily assigning a grant and say you must use 3560, you must use 3580 or 3590 for that matter. We will give grant the request, or said authorize the grant, as long as it is not interfering with an incumbent, with a higher tier, better said.
Let me extend what Rob says, because what he says is absolutely accurate and true. You can request X, and the SAS is going to reply based upon its knowledge of the incumbents. And so you request however much spectrum there was. But the question was, are there guard bands? And there's a flat out answer to that. The answer is no. Not mandatory guard bands. You could create a guard band by requesting spectrum that is far away from the next spectrum holder, but neither in PALS nor in GAA are there fixed Part 96 required guard bands.
That's right. The SAS is certainly not enforcing a guard band.
Perfect.
One of the reasons for that was to allow the maximum use of the spectrum, and the FCC determined early on that it would be best to just allow individual users and the SASs to work out what works best for spectral efficiency, rather than assigning specific 5 or 10 or 7 megahertz spaces between the channels.
Great. Probably building on the spectral efficiency comment you just made, another question exists: is how do we know that a request will not interfere with the same channel that could be nearby? And it could be from yourself, or it could be from another operator. How do we know that it will not interfere?
The simple answer is you don't. You need to do your network planning the same way you would do network planning for an unlicensed spectrum, and that is, go out and see what you see. If you use a spectrum analyzer and you see somebody on the spectrum, then you know there's somebody there. The SAS will assist you in some cases on who's in the area, and particularly if it's incumbents, but you don't. You may need to do your own self-assessment, and you may need to do things which are pretty traditional network planning. There isn't a device that's going to tell you X is nearby.
Great. I'll hold off on those questions for now, more towards the end, so we don't consume all the time right here in the middle of the webinar. But I will finish up this slide. Is how does one register to bid for PALS?
So the PAL auctions have not been formally set yet. We do know that Chairman Pai has indicated, and then there was a public notice, that June 25th is the slated date for the PAL auctions. We assume typical registration format will be followed. You do need to be a qualified bidder. What that means, maybe Rob knows better than I do, but I don't know what makes you a qualified bidder. It's under Part 96, and you can take a look at it there. But you would need to register for the auction. There will be rules concerning how much, for example, you can bid on up to 40 megahertz of spectrum for 10 megahertz PALs. The PAL auctions will be in counties. They're based upon counties across the United States. Counties look different in different states. Some are bigger, some are smaller, some have huge municipalities in them, some don't. There's about 3,000 of them across the United States, and there are going to be 7 slots for PAL auctions per counties, so you can do the math. There's quite a bit of PALs going to be offered. But the formal rules for PAL, for the PAL auction in June have not yet been set. Stay tuned to the same bat channel, and the information will be available from the FCC. In terms of formal registration, that's about as much as I know. I don't know if there's anyone else out there has any better knowledge.
I think that's about where we are right now. And unfortunately, until we get the final rules and how the auction is going to work out, there is a little bit of mystery around that. And perhaps we'll have a follow-up webinar particular to the auction process. So I'll kind of skip the next question, which was going to ask about the deposit, and we'll maybe address that a little bit later in the Q&A section. So kind of moving on, I'm going to have Matt from Cambium and Rick from Baicells kind of participate in these questions that you'll see before you. And I'll start, Matt, with you. Is how does a CPE/UE connect? And I'm going to use the term for all those on the call. You may hear the term AP, base station, eNode B, ENB. That's essentially going to be all interchangeable for the sake of this webinar. And the same goes for CP and UE. Or SM, we'll treat those as interchangeable words, essentially all meaning the same thing for a client or an access point area. But Matt, how does a CPUE connect to an AP or eNode B under CBRS?
So yeah, there's a bunch of different names for all this equipment. What we think about as the eNode B, what we in Cambium call the access point or sector, that is required to go online first. That communicates and gets its grant. And once that happens, you're asking about the subscriber end of things, also known as the CPE. And what we have in the Cambium portfolio today is all of our devices are CBSD Category B devices, which require SAS interface and require them to have a grant established. They've made a provision in the rules. The WIN Forum did this with a lot of urging from a lot of folks like us to add a caveat in the rules such that that device, that subscriber module, can actually beacon out and ask to be attached to that AP, meaning transmit some amount of requests in order to establish a connection, because generally speaking, that CPE device does not have an internet connection at the time when it's trying to register. Therefore, it would be impossible for it to get recognized by the SAS. So we've made a provision. It's called the CPE CBSD, and there's a method for that device to come online and request that grant. It'll be granted the same frequency as the access point or base station or eNode B because it's communicating with that device. And so that's kind of the way that it works. There's a really, we've streamlined that method within Cambium equipment to be able to do that in a very elegant manner so that it's not such a headache to get these devices online.
And that's fair. And so I'd say it's safe to say that not only the access points required to be registered, but every CPE or SM needs to be registered. Is that correct?
For Cambium equipment, certainly that is true. There are other equipment out there that are categorized differently. So all Cambium equipment is known as a CBSD Category B device, which is meant for outdoor deployments and is certainly above the power limits that are the lesser devices. So if you talk about CBSD Category A devices, those could be indoor or outdoor. They have a height restriction on the ones that don't need to register with the SAS. There's a lot of different rules associated with that. And then you talk about UEs, and typically those are the handsets that are under the power limits that require registration with the SAS. Again, just to reiterate one more time, Cambium equipment, the 450 platform specifically, all devices in that platform are CBSD Category B and require CPI and interface with the SAS.
Well, that kind of, Matt, that actually segues pretty good. And Rick, I'll let you chime in too. Now, this comes up quite a bit because, being in the fixed wireless business and as a former operator myself, we're seeing more, system as a service infrastructure, and everything is kind of on a per subscriber basis. And there's a fee attached to that. Is there a way in certain situations, and where I could see actually possible, where we limit the TX power to make sure the ERP is below a value that makes it a CBSD category A to avoid SAS fees?
I know for Cambium
That's a good
equipment,
question.
I won't speak over Rick there, but for Cambium equipment, we are granted as a Category B device, which means that even if you're operating at lower power levels, you're still using a Category B device that's been authorized to operate as a Category B device. So you cannot skirt the rule or try and not have interface with the SAS by operating at a lower power. Now, if there's a case where you're close nearby the eNode B or nearby the access point or sector, certainly the device could be operating lower than 30 dBm EIRP and still adequately making connections and all that kind of operationally, but it's still considered a Category B device. So there's not a method for doing that under the rules as we obtained the grant. Now, could we go back and obtain a grant for Category A for a different device? Certainly we can do that. But right now, as it stands, all devices are Category B and the grant is issued under that rule part.
Great, Matt. Thank you. And so from the way I take it, and Rick, I think you could jump in on this one. From my understanding of the way the rules are, is it doesn't necessarily come down to what the device is doing. It comes down to how the device was certified with CBRS and WinForm. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's definitely correct. I mean, if it has the capacity to operate at a higher power level, it's going to have to be at a B. Even with automatic transmit power control, even if it's turned down to basically nothing because it's right beside the eNode B or the base station, it's still a B, just like Matt said. I totally agree with what he said.
Great. Now I see from the marketplace that I've seen, I see a lot of OEM vendors that use a domain proxy instead of allowing individual devices to talk to the SAS. My question is, why do we see that for the most part?
Well, I think I can address that. Initially, the certificate cost for each device was really cost prohibitive, so much so that it was about the same as the cost of the device just to get a certificate to communicate with the SAS databases. That price has come down substantially, is my understanding. But at that time that decisions were made, obviously you didn't want your customers to have to pay double the price for a CPE. Most manufacturers went with a domain proxy to basically get away from double the cost. We at Baicells, we haven't done it yet, but one of the future firmware revisions on the CPEs will allow our CPEs to communicate direct with the SAS for those people that are not using our cloud core or one of our local EPCs. So you can use it with other vendors, platforms, or whatever. So.
And just to chime in there, from Cambium's perspective, we have a really great management system for our radios called CN Maestro. And it makes perfect sense for us to incorporate the use of Maestro, which is already available in the cloud, to also perform the functions of the domain proxy. And so we felt it not only for cost savings, but for ease of use, ease of operational use. All of that going through the CN Maestro cloud modules makes a whole heck of a lot of sense for our customers. What Rick had mentioned about making it operate directly makes sense for LTE-based equipment. I certainly agree with that. Cambium, I would like to point out here that Cambium technology is the only other technology that's registered with WinForum, meaning registered in the CBRS rules to operate in this band. The only other technology besides 3GPP approved technologies, protocols. So it kind of makes sense that we can help manage that domain proxy and that communication with the SAS through our management system.
All right, thanks, gentlemen. That was good. So I do have some questions that have come up kind of along the way here that are particular to you, and one I would like to kind of address with here is, would it be possible for a Category B device to be enabled to be a Category A if rule changes should occur in the future? So essentially the way I'm going to break that down is if we have the ability to change the certification of a type via software.
So I think we covered that, but what we would need to do in order to make that possible would be to obtain the grant under that rule for the specific piece of equipment that we're talking about. So if we were to obtain a grant from the FCC as a Category A device, most likely it would have a second FCC ID associated with it. And then, yes, you could switch back and forth between the two. But that would be certainly some amount of effort in terms of making that happen for a specific piece of equipment.
Great. Now, this question
Yeah,
has come up.
obviously you'd have to limit your power you'd have to limit your power, make sure you're not going over the EIRP depending on what antenna's in that device, and yeah, it would have to be recertified and all that. So there'd have to be a business case for us as a manufacturer to do that.
Thank you, guys. What about, this comes from an operator perspective. I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this question, but what about those of us that don't allow our management networks to talk outside the world? What are the manual options that are available?
So that's
sure I follow.
Yeah, I think they're asking for kind of a private network that is kind of self-contained, but still transmitting. How do you get the SAS communication, or do you need? So the answer is you always need a hole to the SAS. You have to have communication with the SAS, or that heartbeat message can't go back and forth, and you won't be authorized to transmit in this band. So that's the answer. You have to have a hole. How you arrange that hole or that communication path is up to you guys. But the access point, so in the case of Cambium, again, and I speak from my point of view, of course, but the CN Maestro tool must have a path to the access point or to the sector. The sector can manage the communication to the CPE devices or the SMs. But the sector level device must have access to that CN Maestro domain proxy in order to get to the SAS. So that communication path must be there. It is a specific port and can be configured behind firewalls and all that stuff, but that path must be there to get communication to the SAS.
And that's just to the domain proxy. And currently, for both of you gentlemen representing your respective companies, both of you have a domain proxy that would require that communication.
Right.
Correct.
So kind of a follow-up for that, and I'll ask this about actually both of you, and a simple yes/no answer would suffice in this one, is do you have a local version of Maestro for Cambium, and Baicells, do you have a local version of OMC that acts as a domain proxy, so if they wanted to have a little bit more control over that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Great. Thank you both. All right, we have a few more questions, but we'll move on for now. We'll save those for kind of the general Q&A session. Moving on now to Elizabeth Bowles, President and CEO of Aristotle Unified Communications, and Matt Guzzo is the Network Operations Manager of Hudson Valley Communications and Wireless. We got just a couple practical questions here. A lot of feedbacks come from you all on this call is, what's the operator's perspective of CBRS? So you have guys like me from the antenna perspective, obviously with an operator background, telling you about all the great things of CBRS, but I thought it'd be very important for actually to have operators that are deploying CBRS, whether it be under ICD, of course, now commercial, to ask them just very specific questions. So Matt, I'll start with you and just say, how long have you been operating with CBRS and the SAS, and which SAS vendor have you been using during that time?
We've been operating with the SAS since about mid-September, and we've been working with Google.
Great. Kind of before I jump into that next question, or it says, what speeds are you all achieving? I'm going to ask, like, what channels have you been requesting? What have you been getting granted for spectrum so far?
You know, just toying around with it. We've been playing with a little bit of everything. We typically get grants for 20 and 40 megahertz. We have gotten 60 in a 3CA environment, but we've even gotten a grant from a UE for 100. So, you know, but typically we play with 20 and 40 megahertz.
Great. I guess moving on to that, what kind of speeds have you been seeing? I guess before I ask speeds, what kind of equipment are you deploying right now?
We've been deploying a wide variety of it, but primarily we're deploying Ericsson and Cambium and Baicells for the UE and access point vendors. And as far as the, UE vendors, BEC, Baicells, Cambium.
Great. And what speeds have you been seeing across the prospective platforms? Taking advantage
Very
of
obviously, depending on coverage and everything else in line of sight, but we're seeing, you know, in a perfect environment, over 200 megabits per second in, you know, a 2CA environment with 4T4R.
Fantastic. So what, this is obviously a very loaded question, and I expect this one to take a little bit of thought, is what has impressed you with CBRS?
You know, there's a couple things that are impressing us, you know, as far as the ability to have, you know, the radio side work with, you know, the SAS vendors, and as far as frequency coordination, lower noise floor, cleaner spectrum, and obviously more power has been the best thing, but also the ability to get some non-line of sight propagation and customers that we haven't been able to reach before.
Yeah, I think to echo your point on the power, and that's something I really like to point out to everybody that is operating at NN. Essentially, if you're operating on a 20 megahertz channel today, you're transmitting at 43 dBm EIRP. And in the case of those who are using, and Matt at Cambium, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you get a 40 megahertz grant, I believe you can transmit at 53 dBm EIRP, or equivalent to 200 watts total.
Yeah, with the CN Medusa, we can get to pretty high power levels. That's absolutely right.
Yeah. So that's something to keep in mind for those that are kind of holding off. You actually can stretch a little bit further with your coverage, assuming that the SAS, when you do your request and spectrum evaluation, to say, hey, this is the channel that's available, here's the max EIRP which you can run in that channel. All of that being available to you will give you the ability to reach further and hopefully go faster than you have in the past. Elizabeth, I'll call on you for a little bit. I know you've come down a little ill, so I don't want to pick on you too bad, but what have you been seeing from your CBRS experience so far, and how you're working to deploy that?
I'm going to start out by apologizing to everybody on the call if I cough. I've apparently come down with some kind of a gross bug. We've been seeing pretty much the same thing Jason has. We're using the Google SAS. We've basically seeing similar speeds. We deploy Cambium and Baicells right now, but we're testing Ericsson. And I really have been impressed with the cleanliness of the spectrum. And that's been, gives me a greater confidence level that we have an NN license and we were experiencing a lot of interference. And this helps clear a lot of that out, which I really like. I will tell you that I don't think anybody has said this date. The date's April 17th, by the way, for when you have to convert from Part 90 to Part 96. April 17th.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So that, obviously some practical experience from both of you. I mean, I know CBRS has been, I don't like to use this term too odd because I think we've heard it enough in the industry, kind of game changing, but I do feel that the CBRS spectrum has probably been a game changing amount of spectrum for those who have embraced it and really got in front of some of the rules and just understood what it's going to take to deploy. Are there, kind of nuances? Of course there are going to be. But I think having what you guys have done in the field, and just for perspective, so everybody's aware, Hudson Valley is located in New York, and Aristotle, I believe, in Arkansas. That gives everybody kind of different perspective as far as what kind of challenges they may be dealing with from a topography standpoint. So that's something to keep in mind as you're thinking about CBRS and how you're going to make it go further and faster. So kind of moving into a general Q&A session, we do have a lot of questions. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to get to all of them. We're already an hour into this. So we'll probably go another 15 minutes or so. For those who feel like you need to drop off, please do so. This webinar is recorded. So we will post it on our social channels at a later date. But for those that are willing to hang on, please bear with us. We'll have a little bit of Q&A. So this kind of goes back to, Richard and Rob. This one kind of came up early. It says, please speak to the part about 10 megahertz channels that will be sold in the PAL auction. Limit of 4 per county licensee. So contiguous blocks will work if you happen to get contiguous licenses, 10 megahertz channels, or someone else not licensed and can use GAA. So the way I'm trying to break that question down, so if I'm reading it right, is what if you don't get 40 megahertz contiguous, and will you be able to go around? And before I let Rob and Richard jump in, I want to make it very clear that you're not buying when the PAL comes about, you're buying access within the PAL range. You're not buying a particular channel. The SAS will still determine that. And Rob and Richard, please correct me if I misquoted that, but that's my understanding of the rule.
No, that's correct. So there are a total of 10 channels that potentially in any given county can be used for PAL, 7 of which will be assigned if there are adequate bidders. And the thing with PAL is that you can choose to bid on 1, 2, 3, or 4 10 megahertz accesses. And that is accesses. The rules as we know them so far favor the SAS making an assignment that is contiguous if possible. Both in there's 2 contiguousnesses, if that's a word. The first is within the county itself. So they're going to try and put as many people who have multiple SASs next to each other as possible. So if you have 20 megahertz, that your 20 megahertz will be contiguous. The second contiguousness is between adjacent counties. So if you buy across a number of counties, you would want your spectrum as best as possible to match up with the other counties. This creates some issues because you've got 7 users potentially in each county, or 7 10 megahertz band spectrums or PALs. How you choose which is the right one to go to which licensee is one thing that we're actually tackling in WinForum, because the FCC has only given the guidance that the SAS has to make this determination. How to do that fairly, how to do that in a manner which one party doesn't feel that they're getting better or worse than another, and trying to match up the contiguous nature of those bands, it's a major job. And some bands, not all PAL bands are the same as another. There can be out of band or adjacent band interference. You can be up against the GAA band. So you really do need to make your choices in an intelligent fashion when you're bidding on these to determine how you're coming in. You are not assigned a spectrum when you are bidding on them. You will be only bidding on 10 megahertz groupings. And that's really what we know right now. Remember that if you're operating in PAL, you can also operate in GAA, and anything that isn't actually physically deployed and registered in a PAL protection area is GAA, even if it's a purchased PAL. If you're not operating there opportunistically, the spectrum remains GAA until the PAL operator, the PAL holder, decides to use it.
Thank you. That was great.
Cameron,
Yes.
there was a question on the list about whether you need a deposit to bid. And I have to say that I don't believe the PAL auction is set up to be very supportive of small bidders. And you need to be prepared that you do have to put down a deposit, and you also have to prepay what you purchase. So when you're bidding, that needs to be part of the equation, at least unless that changes.
Yes,
in subsequent rulemaking.
That's right. And I did have that question on there, but understanding that we haven't seen the final rule from the FCC on that, I would expect for those that are listening in still to be prepared to have a deposit available. I've been hearing, and this is just hearsay at best, that 50% of the minimum bid is going to be required for the area that you're focused on.
And something else to note, this is not necessarily directly related to deposit, but the FCC has identified for every PAL across the United States a minimum bid. So each county has its minimum bid levels, and those are published.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, another question that's come up is, are public utilities, let's say water, power, in the same tier as the government when it comes to protections, such as the tier 1 particularly?
The public utilities are not a protected tier, so they do not get any higher level of coverage unless they were to purchase a PAL, or they are not a government incumbent.
Perfect. How does the SAS change the device power? Does it have the ability to send device instructions to reduce its power levels?
It's probably a Rob question. I can answer it if you like.
Rob, you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, hi. Go ahead, Matt. Was that Matt about to chime in?
It was, but I mean, I know for our equipment, absolutely,
Sure.
the SAS can control the power and turn down the power, turn up, up to the limit that you request. But it can certainly turn down if it has calculated that you're causing interference to another operator. Go ahead, Rob, if you want to add on that.
And that, no, just the technicality of that would typically come in the heartbeat response. That the grant, the power could be turned down, the grant could be terminated if there is a need to protect a higher tier.
Perfect. So Rob, I'm going to keep you on the spotlight here, since this one is actually particular to Google. It says, does the Google SAS set the power level at initial registration, or could it reduce the power after operational, potentially causing connected category B CPs to drop off? So let's say we start. Say we start at the maximum power level. Would Google send something to the provision device to drop its power level?
Yeah, so there is a concept of what we call a day 1 grant, meaning the day you request a grant, then the day 2 grant, and that is a function of the nightly CPAS, where the SAS, different SAS vendors coordinate and exchange information. So if there's a potential for interference, you might be granted, and my understanding is that you might be granted a lower power level on the first day. And so the day 2 grant would always be equal to or higher than your day 1 grant. So basically the SAS would take a conservative approach on that initial grant if there's a potential for interference with a higher tier, meaning there's an FSS nearby, or potential interference with a Part 90 operator, et cetera.
Perfect. And Rob, I'm sticking with you here. So I had a feeling we're going to be picking on you a little bit today. What is the smallest frequency increment that the SAS will grant? For example, something like 3621 megahertz instead of 3620. Can it go in 1 megahertz increments or even smaller?
Okay, so the smallest increment is 5 megahertz that Google would grant, that a SAS would grant.
In increments, correct. So 3620, then 3625, and so on.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. And
Perfect.
It would have to be divisible by 5.
Can the SAS assign the same channel to 2 operators if requested by them?
Yeah, and that's exactly what we were going over previously, that if 2 operators, they call a spectrum inquiry, they see that they lock on that they want a particular channel, they could both request that, and as long as they're not interfering with the incumbent, or assuming with a higher tier, they would receive a grant. Now,
So
I do think it's important to note. Pardon me just for a second, Richard. I think this
Sure.
is a pretty important point here. That you know, I think this does, you know, beg the question of, you know, isn't this couldn't this cause a lot of interference? And I do think this is one of the reasons that Google got into being a spectrum, you know, got into CBRS, got involved in being a SaaS, as well as providing other technology to help operators, is that Google is bringing a pretty unique asset to the table here, and that's our clutter information. We have really detailed information about what might be separating two radios, like a hill or a set of trees or buildings, to allow for interference-free operation. So we can take that into account, whether it's via the SAS when we're modeling coexistence, and giving you know, a rank order, for example, a rank ordered list of the available spectrum, or through our network planner if you're using it to model a network and we're calculating propagation. So just a note about what is available out there, at least from Google technology to help.
Perfect. Thank you. Richard, I'm going to ask this of you because I think a bulk of the operators on this call are either WISP or WISPA members. And there's a couple of these questions that have come up in the Q&A and I'm going to call them pirate stations. So how is another operator's recourse take place, or what should we do in the event that we have a neighboring operator that we've tried to be reasonable with? We know they're operating a non-compliant Part 90 device past the expiration date. How do we handle those situations?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm going to answer that, but let me just put in the one thing that Rob didn't mention, and I think is very important. Most of you operating in a fixed environment need your CPE to be on the same spectrum as your AP. So that's called a single frequency group. And so, yes, you can request in groups the ability to have your CPEs be on the same spectrum as your AP, and that wouldn't cause interference internally. In terms of the Part 90-96 conversion and what to do if you've got a neighbor or someone who's causing you interference, what I would suggest early on here in the ecosystem is to try and be as good a neighbor as possible on this. For a period of time, there's going to be some confusion here. I don't advocate in any way, manner, or form, and certainly can't, operating as a pirate network, but do understand that the deadline that Elizabeth mentioned, that April 17th, 2020 deadline, is real. It doesn't apply necessarily to every Part 90 operator. Applies to about 80% of the Part 90 operators out there, and understand that Part 90 operators are not just WISPs. They're also utilities and energy companies and a lot of others. And there's a lot of them out there. And because of the timing, the way things happened in CBRS, there was supposed to be as much as 2 years to allow for the transition and moving out of the band into CBRS or another band. You didn't have to move into CBRS. As many of you know, the supply chain just simply hasn't been there, and the rules weren't set, and it was only a week ago that the band went live. So between a week ago and April 17th is a very short period of time, and on top of which you are dead center in the middle of winter. So for some of you operating throughout the United States, going up on towers and changing out equipment can be a very rough thing to do in the wintertime, maybe even impossible. And the supply chain also creates a problem, as I'm not sure who mentioned it, but I think it was Matt mentioned that you need to have a certain kind of CPE in most places where you don't have a back channel, you don't have another way of communicating with the SAS. You need a CPE CBSD with handshake. That's the one that falls under the KDB. Well, until recently, that equipment wasn't even tested. So we now have some devices that are tested and will go through, can be purchased, but they have to be compatible with the systems you're using. They have to be able to be upgraded if it's an upgradable device, and they have to be entered by a CPI into the system. So that takes time. So you are going to have people who are set in a very, very rock and hard place in your area because, and throughout the areas, because they're particularly in rural areas where they need 365 based upon line of sight, the type of network they have, or they need CBRS to broadcast, but they weren't able to make that transition. And if they go off the air, they will literally leave rural clients without any methodology of getting on the internet. And so my recommendation is to try and work with them as best as possible. I wouldn't run off to the FCC and report them as pirate stations as quickly as you can. That's certainly something you're entitled to do, but understand the circumstance right now. Some of them may be seeking, and I would suggest that they should do it right now. If you are under that April 17th date, file for and you want to continue on your NN license, or you don't feel you have the time to make the transition appropriately, file for a waiver. Because if you don't, you will be a pirate station operating without a license.
Thank you, Richard.
Hey, Cameron, really quick, I just want to point out that the questions and answers in that box, there's a section called Answered, and I've been trying to answer questions as I can, and I just want to make sure people that know about that's there.
I appreciate that because I didn't think I addressed 38 questions all by myself. So please do take the Q&A. There are some questions on there.
There's also on the ULS website, the FCC ULS webpage, in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a box called Data, and under that, there's the 3650 grandfathered wireless protection zone filings. So if you're unsure whether you've grandfathered your 365 base stations or somebody else in your company might have, you might go look at that. I think it's a spreadsheet that you download and see if you can, go past the April 17th deadline. And Richard may have to comment on whether anybody else is allowed to go past that deadline.
Yeah, the April 17th deadline was set in Part 90. You won't find it in Part 96. It was something that was done as a rulemaking procedure by the FCC in Part 90, and it changed the deadlines of certain licenses based upon when they were issued and renewed. That's why I say there are some licenses that will continue on beyond. There's also two classes of category or two groups of Part 90 users. Those that registered in the ULS by, I think it was August of 2015, and those that did not. If you didn't register your devices in the ULS, you still have your license until it expires, but you don't get the grandfathered protection. So you have to operate according to Part 15 and Part 90 accordingly. If you did register, then you are seen as an incumbent until your license expires, either by Part 90 mandate or by the license expiration as it is noted in your license.
Perfect, thank you. So there's another question that's come up. This is it's come up a couple of times here. Someone would like to attempt to justify the cost of the SaaS accounting for 6% of all WISP revenue. Well, first I'll address it saying it's not all WISP. I'm sure it depends on what your ARPU is. This is licensed spectrum or soft license, however you want to word it. And obviously the dynamics have changed over the years. And I can't speak for everyone. I know a lot of operators have been doing additional fees to kind of recover, licensed spectrum access. Some people have just been plain and simple raising the rates. I know that doesn't sound favorable to many, but if it is cutting into your margins, that's something you'll have to take more of a business decision and not really at, I don't want to say at fault of the way things are working out, but in reality, $225 a month, or in some cases, depending on which SaaS vendor you work with or what you negotiate independently, it can be less than that. But that's actually kind of a small price to pay to get access to some pretty fantastic spectrum. So I would take a look at what you benefit versus what you spend. Now, with that said, there are a number of questions. Unfortunately, I just don't think we're going to be able to get to at once. But there's one more kind of important one that I will bring up before we close out this webinar today is how do all the SaaS maintain, or do they maintain simultaneous record keeping, kind of like a credit bureau? So do they sync up periodically? How do they know if neighbor A in the same town that may be using a different SaaS than Google? Rob, how do you guys all talk together?
Yeah, there's a nightly what's called CPAS, and during the CPAS, what's exchanged are location of the CBSD, the channels they're using, the grants that they have, and all that information is exchanged. It's exchanged anonymously, of course, but between all the SaaSes, and that's been going on for quite some time, and that's the way we're aware of what else is out there.
Well, there's several questions noticed about the length of time it takes to get a grant for like a CPE. Can you address those questions? They got an installer out on site. They're installing a CPE. They want to know how long that installer has to stay there before they get a grant.
Yeah, I can only speak to how Google SaaS operates, but we will provide a grant within minutes. Grant response, better said, within minutes. Can't guarantee the grant will be granted, but we'll provide a response within minutes. You do not have to wait for 24 hours to know if you even have a grant.
Excellent, thank you.
Perfect. And Matt, I think you had mentioned this earlier, so I will actually throw in one more question here. It says, it was stated that we would set up a frequency group so all CPEs can get the same spectrum as the eNode B. Do we have to define the number of devices within this group?
That's a bit of a complex question with regards to how the SaaSes treat groups, and they call them coexistence groups. So coexistence management, or the management of interference among different devices, is a very complex topic among the SaaSes and CBRS in general. Not everything is completely worked out yet on how this is going to work. Now, I can say though that with Cambium devices, with synchronization and all the things that are built into the system as we have it today, we are working very closely with all the SaaSes to ensure that our use case is carefully considered in how those coexistence groups are managed and put out there. There is nothing the user needs to do or the operator needs to do at this point in terms of controlling those groups. And the coexistence manager as it is in CBRS will be automated. So there's a lot to come on that topic, and we're working as best we can with all the parties involved to make sure that not only LTE groups well with LTE, but Cambium equipment groups well with LTE as well. So that's all part and parcel to achieving this innovation in this band and trying to make best use of available spectrum.
Thank you. And Mr. Guzzo, I'll pick on you here, since this is actually a procedural question as it pertains to an operator. One customer here has asked, so what if a grant isn't provided, the customer can't be installed? And I know that you and I have actually had this conversation about you almost have to change the process in which you once installed customers, and kind of moving to, do you go out and survey customers first to make sure you're going to get a grant request, and see if you get them online and go back and install later?
Agreed. Procedurally, we're still working through some of the what you're talking about right there too. We're trying to find the best method in regards to that. Do you go out there? Do you do a site survey? Do you because you have to provide very accurate coordinates to do this. So we've been kind of honestly still working through that process.
Perfect, thank you. And I know there's been a couple questions on people transitioning their point-to-point links from NN to SAS. There's no really good answer to that other than talk to your particular manufacturer. They all have to be certified. So that would be where I would start with you. We are unfortunately out of time. We will do our best to get to these questions and probably put them on our Facebook page. Please do follow Alpha Wireless on our various social channels. I would like to thank our entire panel for joining today. It was great. I think we'll have a follow-up one here in a couple weeks or so, maybe talk a little bit more about auction and how that's going to go. But thank you all again for joining, and I really appreciate you taking this time out of your day to see what Alpha Wireless can offer you.
Thanks for putting this together, Cameron.
Thanks, Cameron.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, and thank you to everyone who attended. We really appreciate it.
If people have questions and they're with WISPA, they can feel free to get a hold of me as well. I'm happy to do that.
Thanks, everyone.